Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. We'll go ahead and get started. In case you don't know me, I'm Derek Turner, and I'm teaching the philosophy department and serving as the director of the Gillian Center. Before I introduce, I haven't been in front of a group like this in a while. Before I introduce our awesome speaker, just a couple of quick thank yous. Jen Lamb and Kelly Wagner. There's Jen. Kelly is actually working back and back. Just thanks to you both. The awesome, everyone knows Jen and Kelly, the fantastic Gillian Center team who helped make all this possible. Quick shout out to the G. Thomas Lambert Endowed Lecture Fund. This is sponsored by the Lambert Fund, and also thanks to the Environmental Studies Program and the Department of Sociology, who are co-sponsoring the talk. So I am really excited to introduce Professor Julia Flagg, who many of you know already. She is Associate Professor of Sociology and Environmental Studies, also serving as director of the Environmental Studies Program, and also serving this year as Senior Faculty Fellow in the Goodwin Center. So it's been awesome to get to work together with Professor Flagg. This is also her second run at Senior Fellow in the Goodwin Center. We had such a great time working together a couple of years ago that the whole team thought, hey, we got to get Professor Flagg to do this again. So I want to quick shout out for some of her courses. You might keep an eye out. She teaches courses on environmental sociology, climate and society, disasters. The disaster seminar coming next semester. Yeah, awesome. And in addition to the project that she's going to share with us this afternoon, she's actually worked on a variety of different issues. So she's published, just for example, a paper on water quality and drinking water standards in the journal Water Resources Management. She's published a paper in the journal Climate Risk Management on how people use climate information at different levels of social aggregation. She's published on research on campus recycling programs. And that all kind of comes after some of her earlier work on disasters and disaster recovery. So this afternoon, though, this is the really exciting part. She has a new book out with MIT Press, aiming for net zero, Costa Rica's green elite and the struggle to mitigate climate change. So let's welcome Professor Flagg.
Thank you so much, Professor Turner, and thank you everyone for coming today. I do just want to announce that the talk is being recorded. We have a student joining us from Ecuador. Hi, Lucy. And so glad you could make it. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight to hear my talk, Aiming for Net Zero, Costa Rica's Green Elite and the Struggle to Mitigate Climate Change. So not to duplicate everything Professor Turner just said, but just want to let you know I'm an environmental sociologist. My prior research has explored topics as diverse as the nation's carbon neutrality pledges or pledges to reduce emissions and balance them with carbon offsets. I explored the effects of disasters in communities in New Jersey as well as along the Gulf Coast. I teach here in the sociology department of the Environmental Studies Program, and like Professor Turner said, I'm also serving as the Senior Fellow of the Goodwin Center for the Environment this year. Here's a list of my classes. You may recognize them. You may have homework from them to do tonight after the talk: Nature and Society, Climate and Society, Sociology of the Environment, and Disasters. And I say all this just to kind of ground you and let you know that throughout my teaching and my research, my lens is sociological, but my approach is interdisciplinary. And I think that might be a helpful way to kind of ground us for the talk. So the focus of my talk for tonight is on why and how decision makers in Costa Rica have made commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the argument that I make is that the case of climate policy development in Costa Rica is due to a green elite mobilization within a historical context of a more egalitarian class structure. Don't worry, I'll break that all down as we go. In terms of an overview for my talk, I'm going to begin by discussing the problem of global climate change and the possible promise of Costa Rica. I'll then get into my first research question, which is why has Costa Rica made more pledges to reduce emissions than other countries? Then I'll get into my second question, which is looking within Costa Rica, who has made these pledges and how have they done so? I'll discuss my findings, where I've identified 4 periods of climate action across recent history, recent decades in Costa Rica, and I'll wrap up with some lessons learned. And again, this talk is drawn from my book, which was published last month. I've had to really streamline a lot of things, so I explore all these things in much greater complexity in the book. So as most of us sitting here in this room probably already know, we're living with the problem of human-induced climate change. We already see that there's been more than 1 degree Celsius of warming compared to industrial times. And this is due to things like the burning of fossil fuels to heat homes, power industrial systems, move our transportation systems, and deforestation. Now, largely this first surge of greenhouse gas emissions has come from countries in what we call the wealthier global north. And as you know from reading the news every day, we're living with the consequences of this warming, right? With daily reports the world over telling us about droughts, hurricanes, flood, wildfires, etc. Within this context, communities around the world will need to pursue climate adaptation or adapt in order to live in a more dangerous, less safe world. And this is critical and essential. At the same time, there's an urgent need for climate mitigation, which refers to efforts to either decrease greenhouse gas emissions or increase efforts to track or sequester those emissions. And this is important because even what seem like small achievements in mitigation can have significant impacts, right? Even 1/10 of a degree of Celsius warming can make for a much safer world for people and communities around the world. Now, as many countries and communities around the world have dragged their feet on the problem of climate mitigation, including, of course, the United States, there are some notable exceptions, including the country of Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a small Central American country nestled in between Nicaragua and Panama. It's about the size of the US state of West Virginia and home to about 5 million people. Despite its small size, it hosts an impressive 5% of global biodiversity. And over the last about 50 years, Costa Rican leaders have set aside about 1/4 of the land area in protected national parks and biological preserves, which are free from potential development. Costa Rica has Latin America's longest and most stable democracy and has no army and hasn't had an army for quite some time. Just to briefly transport you from the Chew Room to Costa Rica, I want to show you a couple of pictures, including this one of the Monteverde Cloud Forest Biological Preserve, which is worth visiting if you get the chance, an amazing biological preserve with over 10,000 hectares of pristine cloud forest and lots of biodiversity. And here are a couple pictures of some of the species for which Costa Rica has come to be best known, including the red-eyed tree frog and the resplendent male quetzal. Now, I would love to just show you beautiful pictures for the rest of our time together, but to get back to my point, Costa Rica has committed to some of the most ambitious climate mitigation promises out there, including developing the region's first payments for environmental services program, investing in and supporting some of the first internationally financed climate mitigation projects, making a carbon neutrality pledge, following up with a net zero pledge, and very recently pledging to decarbonize its economy or get its economy running without the use of emitting carbon. Now, are all these pledges just sort of symbolic politics, right, without any kind of actual influence on the ground? Well, the Climate Action Tracker is a scientific website that assesses and tracks nations' commitments to climate mitigation to assess how serious those commitments are. The Climate Action Tracker rates Costa Rica as being almost sufficient with meeting the Paris Agreement goal of just a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. To be clear, that's the second best, meaning the second highest rating that a nation can earn. And as of this As of this talk, there's no nations that the Climate Action Tracker considers sufficient with meeting a 1.5 degrees Celsius only increase. It might be worth just taking in the magnitude of that for a second, right? So Costa Rica truly is one of the leaders in terms of global climate mitigation efforts. So why does this matter, right? Costa Rica is a very small country. Why does focusing on Costa Rica matter? Well, I argue that there's two core reasons. The first is in terms of real world application, right? If Costa Rica is one of these almost sufficient nations with limiting global warming to just 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's important to figure out what worked well there, right? And to identify some transferable lessons that we might apply or move to other contexts. The second is more of a research or a scholarly rationale, which is that among social science research on climate change, more of that research has focused on climate adaptation, right? And to be clear, this is essential, important research. But there's been far less research on climate mitigation from a social science perspective. Among that smaller body of research, most research on climate mitigation from the social sciences has been quantitative and cross-national. Looking at, for example, why do some nations make carbon neutrality pledges? Again, this is important and very interesting work. But none of this work really explores the on-the-ground processes of climate policy development. How does this actually come to be, right? And in order to do that, I argue that we need a case study to identify the on-the-ground processes of climate policy development, and to do so in the global south. In terms of my research methods, I conducted various fieldwork visits to Costa Rica. While there, I conducted 39 interviews with people in decision-making positions. I would call this a snowball sample. These are not a random selection of people, but rather people in key, again, decision-making positions like government, civil society, academia, and science. Notably, my sample includes 6 former ministers of the environment, which is the highest ranking environmental official in Costa Rica, working directly with the president. In addition, I identified historical or archival documents while here in the United States, and then also when in Costa Rica. And these include things like speeches, newspaper articles, and planning documents. Interviews that I conducted in Spanish, or planning documents that I read in Spanish, I translated into English. So you'll just see, when you see a quote, you'll only see it in English tonight. And then to write my book, I went through a process of weaving together these various forms of data and producing what I call a narrative or a story, right, of climate policy development in Costa Rica. Let me return briefly to my 2 research questions. The first, again, being why has Costa Rica made more climate mitigation pledges than other nations? And second, within Costa Rica, how has this happened? Who has made this possible? And again, my argument is that the case of climate policy development in Costa Rica is due to a green elite mobilization within a historical context of a more egalitarian class structure. Let's move first to this first question. Why Costa Rica, right? Costa Rica is a small, post-colonial society with a relatively marginalized position in the global economy. Right, its small size, its development status would seem to inhibit, right, its pledges to lead on climate mitigation. For a long time, there was a belief that people in small, low-income, developing post-colonial societies would not care about the environment until their material needs were met. So it's called the post-materialist values thesis. So again, it's the basic idea that until people had achieved a relatively high level of wealth, they couldn't also experience a shift in their values that would free them up to care about the environment. Now, thankfully, this theory has been debunked in recent years because it makes a lot of assumptions about the way people are and the kinds of things that they care about. And just to give you one example, recent research shows that people in low-income developing countries often have as high or higher levels of concern about things like the environment compared to people in wealthier countries from the global north. So just to give you one example, this is a chart showing data collected by researchers from Yale in 2002. And they asked people from a variety of different countries, including Costa Rica and the United States, how worried are you about climate change? Fully 64% of people in Costa Rica said that they were very worried, compared to just 32% of people in the United States, right? So twice the percentage of people who are very worried about climate change exist in Costa Rica compared to the United States. This is just one example, but indicative of a broader pattern that people do not need to experience a rise in their material well-being in order to have a shift in their values and therefore be concerned about the environment. However, levels of inequality still matter. because they shape the ability of states to respond to a problem like climate change. So this is why when I asked Manuel, a biologist, and that's a pseudonym, these are all pseudonyms, I should have said that. When I asked Manuel, a biologist and civil society advocate in Costa Rica, why had Costa Rica made a carbon neutrality pledge? He explained, quote, "You don't need to be a developed country because we're not, but you've got to have human rights and water to get to this goal. It's not going to happen in Haiti, one of the most politically unstable and poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere and throughout the world." So what I argue in my book is that climate policies differ by class structure, and that historically Costa Rica's class structure has been more egalitarian, and this has created a context of good governance that has led to the kinds of policies mentioned before. How did this happen, right? Let's look to history briefly for some explanation, with again the caveat that I had to simplify and streamline this history for this presentation. Costa Rica was less marginalized during the colonial period than other regions in Latin America, right? What does that mean? The Spanish set up shop less in Costa Rica due to a variety of political, economic, and ecological reasons. This means that in the wake of independence, as early as 1821, Costa Rican leaders were able to develop with a greater degree of independence from Spanish colonial institutions than elsewhere in Central America. As early as the late 1820s, state leaders in Costa Rica divided formerly commonly held tracts of land into private tracts of land. Now, this small, seemingly random detail from the 1800s may not seem like it matters, but it had the really important effect of creating a large class of small landowners and coffee producers who owned their land and made profit from the coffee they produced on their own land, right? So kind of in sociological terms, they made their profit from their land instead of being part of a kind of proletariat class or working for somewhere else, as was the case in many other parts of Central and Latin America. Within this context, right, where the ruling sort of party, where the ruling political leaders were not all that different from these small landholders, this created a context where political elites were incentivized to invest in the public good. As early as the 1880s, political leaders in Costa Rica created a system of universal education, and this would have seemed nonsensical, would not have made sense in other regions throughout Latin America. But at this time, elites saw that by investing in the public, they could increase the standing of their nation and increase the profits and well-being of the society. The last sort of feature to think about historically is that several of the notable changes for which Costa Rica has come to be known, perhaps maybe the reason you know Costa Rica for having no standing army, were led by a former president, Jose Figueres Ferrer, pictured here in the late 1940s. He enacted a number of very notable things for which Costa Rica has come to be known, including giving the right to vote to women, establishing a significant wealth tax, which further reduced those economic gaps between the wealthy and the poor, and leading in the abolishment of the army. All of these things have had the influence of helping to enhance the middle and lower classes in Costa Rica, and has made Costa Rica a leader in economic and social development for several decades, right? So although these data are pulled from 2020, they're indicative of a broader pattern of Costa Rica outpacing its neighbors in Latin America in terms of metric of social and economic well-being. So as you can see, Costa Rica has a higher literacy rate in its adult population. People in Costa Rica live longer. Costa Rica has a much higher income per capita compared to most other nations in Central and Latin America, and has a lower infant mortality rate. So to sum up so far, right, these smaller gaps between the wealthy and the poor, that beginning creation of a landowning class in Costa Rica has led to a pattern of good governance, and this has taken the form of major investments in people's well-being and the environment. Now, although this kind of macro structural economic explanation is of course very important, it tells us very little about what has actually happened on the ground. And to do that, we need to look kind of more closely to see who has made these pledges, how has that happened. This is where some of my interview data come in. There's a theory in environmental sociology called ecological modernization theory, which essentially makes the argument that as societies grapple with scarcity or depleting resources and economic environmental collapse, they will take steps to go green, right? And there's lots of examples of the ways in which companies, countries, groups kind of super industrialize their way out of ecological problems or use technology to go green. So it's just one example, right? Given the problems of gasoline-powered vehicles, we're currently seeing a surge in electric vehicles, right? As consumers try to get off these old polluting vehicles and on to so-called cleaner ones, right? Now, to be clear, we can and should debate the economic, environmental, social, political costs and benefits of these efforts to super-industrialize, right? But more to my point is that by focusing so much on technological innovations, we miss what the kind of political process of greening looks like, right? And that's what I explore in my book. What I find is that the WHO in Costa Rica, who has done this, are the members of a small green elite who have developed and advanced these policies. To be clear right off the bat, these are people with very modest economic resources. These are not kind of the way you might think about the way we often use the term elite in the US, right? With people with vast, resources and wealth. That's not what I mean at all. But within sociology, we don't just use elite to refer to somebody who has economic resources. There's other kinds of resources you can have as well, including the ability to move the needle in political spheres of influence, right? Lots of access to cultural capital, lots of access to key political moments or key decisions that matter. And what I find is that the members of this small green elite, who I'll talk about in just a moment, seize on opportunities to connect current climate policies with key historical moments from Costa Rica's past. I find that there's three features that the members of this green elite share in common. First is that they're small in size, there's not that many of them. Second is that they're socially cohesive. And the third is that they're geographically cohesive. Right, the first feature of the green elite is that they're small in size, there's not that many of them. So when I asked Juan, an academic from San Jose, about who he worked with and what that was like, he said, everyone knows everyone. Whichever sector you're in, environment, energy, etc., you know everyone in that sector, right? Research shows that in small countries, right, the size of the elite is also small. Now, clearly in economically inegalitarian context, that can lead to problems like corruption. That's not the kind of context, right, we're talking about here, to just pull up those ideas that I was talking about before. But with a small group and a small number of people in decision-making positions, this leads to a higher incentive to act and to work together, right? So think about how lots of times when we're assigned to committees, if we really want something to get done, what happens, right? We create subcommittees where it's harder to hide, it's harder to hide from responsibility, right? Theoretically. So with those smaller groups, right, there's a higher incentive to work together and to reach a decision quickly. But this is not the only thing that matters, right? It's not just that there's only a few people in key decision-making positions, but rather that they're also socially cohesive. So what do I mean by that? Here I pull from some research on political science showing that in small countries, the members of the elite have social connections that are historically based, right? So what does this mean? This means that when they come together to discuss something like net zero over the last couple of years, or carbon neutrality the year before that, they likely have already worked before together many times, sometimes over 3-4 decades, and they foresee the need and possibility to work together again soon, right? This, I argue, also facilitates and incentivizes cooperation, right? Because they know they'll be seeing each other again soon. In addition, most of the members of what I call this green elite have similar social experiences. Almost all of them have been to the US or Western Europe for a PhD, and they return to Costa Rica and work in the exact same educational institutions, government positions, civil society organizations, etc. Right? This creates a kind of revolving door of a high degree of movement across things that may seem unusual in other kinds of contexts. So just to give you a couple of examples, Pablo, one of my interviewees, had a PhD from the US in the natural sciences, became an academic back in San Jose, became a civil society advocate back in San Jose, and became a high-level government, part of a high-level government coalition that was working for the Ministry of the Environment. Similarly, Rodrigo had a sort of similar life trajectory. He had a PhD from Western Europe in a similar field, became an academic at a neighboring institution, entered industry, entered into that same high-level government coalition, ended up serving as one of the ministers of the environment. Last kind of common feature among the green elite is that they're not just socially similar, they're also geographically similar. So, or geographically cohesive, sorry. Costa Rica, like many nations, is highly urbanized. It's over 80% of people living in urban areas. But what makes Costa Rican urbanization a little bit different is that the 4 major cities of Costa Rica, San Jose, Cartago, Heredia, and Alajuela, are located within just 4% of the national territory in an area deemed the Grand Metropolitan Area. This means that people and institutions are physically near each other, right? Now, people are not atoms. Just because we see each other, run into each other, doesn't mean we're going to, combust or have a chemical reaction, of course, right? But literally being near each other puts people in each other's orbits, and again, I argue, facilitates action, facilitates the degree to which they know each other and are interested in working together. Although these features kind of strengthen the green elite and bring them together, it's important to remember that all this kind of inclusivity of these members of the green elite also relies on the exclusion of others deemed different, right? And the reliance on national myths to do so. Historically, right, the land known as Costa Rica or thought of as Costa Rica is limited to that central fertile valley where coffee was historically produced and where those major cities are. And Costa Ricans in that central valley, the coffee producing ones, has historically identified as white. This has enabled them to exclude themselves from people who are different. Most notably, Black West Indian laborers brought to Costa Rica in the 1880s to build the railroads and plant bananas along the Atlantic coast. And this is still today where Black Costa Ricans tend to live in the greatest numbers, right? So the strength of these kind of intra-group ties also relies on the exclusion of others. The last thing about the green elite is that I argue that these kind of social welfare policies that Costa Rica has come to be so well known for, again, wealth taxes, the abolishment of the army, etc., become embodied in particular people. And I've already mentioned perhaps the most famous, which is Jose Figueres Ferrer, but they also become embodied in people in his close orbit, most notably including his children, Jose Figueres Ferrer and Cristiana Figueres, who you may recognize that name, and we'll come back to her in just a second. I'd like to move now to a discussion of my findings, which is that I find that there have been 4 periods of climate action in Costa Rica from the late 1980s, the mid 1990s, the mid 2000s, and the late 2010s. And as we go through these, I'll point out how the kind of theoretical and contextual factors we've been discussing so far, including levels of economic inequality, governance, development, and members of the green elite subculture, matter for moving climate action forward at these times. Let's go first to the late 1980s. Samuel, a former minister of the environment, told me that 1986, quote, is the beginning of the work on decarbonization. Now, this is surprising, right? We're living in a moment where everybody seems to be decarbonizing. It's ubiquitous, right? This would not have been the case in 1986, right? When that term probably didn't exist. So what was happening then that made it so that he said that 1986 is the beginning of the work on decarbonization? I argue that this is a period of institutional restructuring that maybe while the needle didn't move per se on climate action, it set up later periods that would enable really notable policies that Costa Rica has come to be known for. This period begins with the 1986 presidential election of Oscar Arias Sanchez. And he kind of ran his platform on the idea of working out a Central American peace plan that was independent from the one that the United States had written, right? He was very focused on Central American autonomy. And he made some efforts to do that, inviting rebel groups from across Central America into the planning process. And he was awarded with these efforts, he was awarded for these efforts with a Nobel Peace Prize in 1987. It's important to kind of think about how impactful that was, right? He's the first Central American to receive the prize. I think one of the first in the first 5 Latin Americanists ever to receive a Nobel Peace Prize. And the economy of Costa Rica changed tremendously in the years after his receipt of this award. I believe in the 7 years following his receipt of the Peace Prize, tourism jumped to the #1 contributor to the Costa Rican GDP, right? Surpassing things like agricultural exports like bananas and coffee. So this kind of raised the international profile of Costa Rica. In addition, to look to the green elite for a moment, what was going on here is that President Arias established the Ministry of the Environment in 1986 and separated the environmental ministry from the industry and commerce ministry, something that would have been very unusual at that time, and put Alvaro Umana in charge of the ministry. This is really exceptional. Umana has a PhD in environmental engineering from Stanford. He's since won a Goldman Prize, I believe. He's continued to be a real activist globally for international rights and well-being. And his appointment to this position mattered. So as William, a minister of the environment who came after Alvaro Umana, said that with Umana's appointment, for quote, the first time we had a person in government that knew the theme about the natural environment and the consequences of destruction to the natural environment, and specifically the problem of deforestation. Let's move to the second period, the mid-1990s. This period begins with the election of President Jose Maria Figueres, the son of Jose Figueres, mentioned earlier. Costa Rica by this time had enjoyed considerable economic success, in large part due to the effects of the Peace Prize mentioned earlier. Costa Rica was more developed and a more stable domestic economy than other countries elsewhere in Central America. However, although this really sounds like a good thing, Costa Rica was beginning to sort of become a victim of its own success, right? So it's worth hearing from Robert here, an advisor to President Figueres, who told me that the money dried up by this time since the United States, Costa Rica was the quote, golden child and qualified as a middle-income country. Therefore, leaders in Costa Rica saw climate change as sustainable development and said, this is the way to get international funds by being a quote, thought leader in these two emerging areas, right? In other words, Costa Rican leaders enjoyed political success and enjoyed economic stability, but had to get creative in terms of how to keep going on this path. And it's also worth remembering that these are the real early days of global climate action, right? As Robert also explained to me, climate change was not like it is today, but more theoretical, more thinking about how to actually put ideas about climate change into practice. Well, Costa Rican leaders at this time became very active and enthusiastic about hosting internationally financed climate projects or pursuing projects through the AIJ from the UNFCCC. And to make a kind of complicated story simple, essentially what happened is that the United Nations was very interested in pursuing climate mitigation projects for all the reasons we've been talking about so far, right? The need to keep global warming to a smaller level. And it proposed that wealthy developed countries could pay for mitigation projects in the global south, right? That this would have a net benefit the world over. It's important to point out that many countries, many developing countries rejected this framework, right? Most notably China, which said, absolutely not. If you want to go develop mitigation projects, go do it in your own territory, right? And it sort of makes sense, so you can understand the rationale for that. Costa Rica, on the other hand, said, we are open for business. And became a leader in hosting AIJ projects, right? It's notable to just pause there and think about how interesting that is, right? That it's very easy for a small country like Costa Rica to just follow what China, the leader of the G77, was doing. And it was really interesting that they departed from the China path and picked their own path. By the early 2000s, by about 2002, Costa Rica had the most AIJ projects among any nation in Latin America, which is really interesting if you, again, think about Costa Rica's small size, comparing it to large countries like Brazil, et cetera. Most projects related to climate mitigation, again, that were funded by countries in the global north had to do with forestry, again, because of Costa Rica's protection of forests, and it really became a leader in this sense. But if we kind of, again, zoom in a little bit to look at who was the Green elite at this time and what were they doing and how did they matter, people kept using the term a team formed at this time. So when I asked, what does that mean? Who was part of this team? They would say the Figueres team mattered. And what it was is that about 10 members of the Figueres administration went to Harvard, took the same classes, and then President Figueres and his minister recruited them to come back to Costa Rica and work there. So they literally had the same educational experience at Harvard, the same professors, et cetera. So as Paolo, an advisor to President Figueres, said, the common educational background quote, helped the members of the team because it gave them a common language and facilitated their action with the AIJ projects and other things related to forestry at that time. In addition, Robert, another advisor to President Figueres, said that the time at Harvard was a, quote, incubation period and a time when there was a, quote, think tank of ideas related to sustainable development and environmental economics. So the Figueres himself was very instrumental in terms of bringing international students back, recruiting international students back to Costa Rica, and using their shared knowledge to move on domestic and global climate policies at this time. The third period begins in 2006 with the election again of President Oscar Arias to the presidency. And within a couple months of Arias returning to the presidency, his advisors close to him convinced him of the need for Costa Rica to make a peace with nature, a Paz con la Naturaleza pledge. Clearly, right, highlighting or branding the commitment to him, right, and reminding everyone that they had a Nobel Peace Prize winner back in the presidency. The Peace with Nature pledge included a variety of sub-goals, among them the carbon neutrality pledge. And Arias leapt right on the opportunity to tell the world how amazing it was that Costa Rica was doing this. He traveled all over the world talking about carbon neutrality and how Costa Rica was leading. And he said in La Nación, the national newspaper, abolishing net carbon will be for us the equivalent of the abolishment of the army that Don Pepe Figueres did and the pacification of Central America, which we achieved during my first presidency. And just to be very clear, Arias did not achieve this pacification of Central America during his first presidency. It's a very, very aspirational way to describe what he did. But you can see, again, the connection of carbon neutrality back to abolishing the army, right? And again, that real interest in connecting where we're going with our national identity about who we are and what Costa Rica stands for. Now, yes, carbon neutrality had some kind of symbolic politics associated with it, but there was also a good amount of actual planning and serious conversations happening between government and industry at this time. However, this hit a roadblock in early 2009, still during Arias's presidency, when he declared that gold mining at Las Crucitas near the border with Nicaragua was open for the benefit of the public interest, right? To be clear, this gold mine is in a highly sensitive ecological zone, home to the great green macaw, an endangered bird, and a really sort of majestic species. And also, to be clear, gold mining is extremely bad for the environment, right? It relies on these kind of open pit mines, which you can see here, and is most notable for its kind of damaging effects to local waterways. This has been a nightmare in Costa Rica, and I'm happy to say more about that later. But it really was a direct contrast, obviously, to everything that Arias and his administration was doing related to carbon neutrality. But if we think for a second about sort of what was happening at that time, right? By this point, 2009, Costa Rica's economy was hurting. It was beginning to deal with feel the effects of the global recession, right? And in this type of context, you can understand why a political elite might declare mining to be in the public interest, or might declare mining to be open. To be clear, it was a very bad idea, right? But in this kind of context of rising economic inequality, right, and feeling the effects of the global recession, not having as many wealthy global north tourists coming to visit Costa Rica, politicians will, like Arias, look for a quick fix, right? And again, to be clear, gold mining is not a quick fix. But it makes sense to sort of try and understand that reasoning. And lots of times these types of extractions across Latin America are supported by the state. So Costa Rica is just an example of a pattern throughout the region. This brings us to our fourth and final period, which begins in 2009 with the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties meeting. This is the annual meeting where nations come and talk about what they're going to do about climate change. It's actually happening this week in Azerbaijan, if you're interested. Some COP meetings are sort of more important or more sort of, they get more enthusiasm than others. And the 2009 Copenhagen meeting was certainly one that garnered a lot of attention and worry and hope, right? It was seen by many activists, scientists, government politicians as the kind of last hope for creating a legally binding commitment to actually steeply reduce emissions, right? So much so that Many activists from around the world called it Copenhagen instead of Copenhagen. Unfortunately, it ended without a legally binding agreement, and also led to a kind of institutional questioning of, is the UN really the right group to be handling how we approach climate mitigation? In the wake of this kind of failure at Copenhagen, Christiana Figueres, sister of Jose Maria and the daughter of Jose Figueres mentioned earlier, is appointed as the UNFCCC Executive Secretary. She has extensive diplomatic experience within Costa Rica and throughout Latin America in terms of developing a kind of clean, equitable economy. And she sort of does a autopsy on the UNFCCC and tries to figure out a way forward to how to galvanize again energy and support around the UN-led action on climate change. Her work culminates in the 2015 Paris Agreement, which certainly, while not perfect, again, kind of inspired hope, and she went all over the world talking to both fossil fuel producing nations and non-fossil fuel producing nations about the need to get on board with the plan to limit global warming to just 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we really see a lot of the rhetoric around 1.5 emerge really from and since that meeting. Back home in Costa Rica, Costa Ricans elected President Carlos Alvarado Quesada. If he looks young, it's because he is. He was elected at the age of 40. And he really represented a generational shift in Costa Rica. And on day one of his presidency, he started talking about the need to decarbonize the economy. He showed up to the inauguration in a hydrogen-powered bus with cyclists, very symbolic. But again, on day one, right, talking about the need to decarbonize. It's worth noting, right, that this was during the first Trump administration, right, and a kind of global tilt to the right. So the fact that Costa Rica elected this really relatively far leftist president who was talking about decarbonization on day one is really notable. Although he came out wanting to prioritize decarbonization, decarbonization and climate plans in general quickly moved to the back burner as Alvarado faced some of the largest labor strikes in about 50 years in Costa Rica. Public sector workers, hospital workers, et cetera, gathered en masse in San Jose and throughout the country to protest cuts to public welfare, public workers, right? Again, it kind of reminds us of some tensions that I've been talking about so far, right? This desire to kind of lead on climate change, yet with rising economic inequality and rising dissatisfaction with public protections for workers, people mobilized and decarbonization didn't really happen. So where does this leave us? Well, in 2019, a couple of journalists from the New York Times went down to Costa Rica and tried to investigate, what's really happening with decarbonization. And they spoke with Francisco Alpizar, an economist from Cartier, a really impactful educational institution in Turrialba called the Tropical Agricultural Research and Higher Education Center. And he told them, quote, if we, meaning Costa Rica, can't pull decarbonization off by 2050, it's likely no other country can pull it off. That would be really bad. So where do things stand in Costa Rica? Where are they? What have they actually, what has happened with emissions? Where are they going? Well, on the one hand, right, if we look at total carbon dioxide emissions in metric tons or kilotons from Costa Rica over the last several decades, including changes, including land use change in forest, including emissions from land use change in forestry, we see that Costa Rica has dramatically reduced its emissions. This is a good thing, right? So when we include land use change in forestry, emissions have dropped precipitously. This means that Costa Rica has been very successful at things like slowing deforestation, right? However, the picture is a little bit more complex if we look at emissions but exclude land use change in forestry. Here, emissions have tripled, right? So this tells us that Costa Rica, like any country in its position in the global economy, is wrestling with this tension of wanting to pursue economic development while also increasing its emissions and having a greater environmental influence. So the picture is muddy, right? On the one hand, emissions have improved. On the other hand, things are definitely moving in the wrong direction as emissions continue to rise. To talk briefly about a couple of recent current events in Costa Rica and where things stand, there's been a notable increase in crime, mostly over the last 2 to 3 years. began on the Atlantic coast, but has slowly moved its way in towards San Jose. As people are losing jobs due to COVID, most notably over the last couple of years, but also some other larger economic factors, that they turn to crime to protect their families, to have their basic needs met. And this has been a real problem domestically for Costa Rica and a change to its international image. In addition, there's been a political turn back toward the right after Carlos Alvarado mentioned earlier. Costa Ricans elected Rodrigo Chavez, an extreme right-wing politician with views in line with Jair Bolsonaro or President Trump. And third is that Costa Rica in 2021 kind of created this really innovative and ambitious alliance called the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, partnering with wealthy developed countries or wealthy regions to truly kind of begin this discussion about getting off oil and gas, right, moving beyond fossil fuels. However, a year later, Costa Rica dropped out, right, saying that it was no longer interested in this and that it needed fossil fuels to develop, right? So where does this lead us, right? Sorry to end on a bad note. Does this kind of refute everything I just told you? Well, I would say actually, it doesn't, right? It actually conveys some of the core themes of my work. As inequality has again grown due to factors like a neoliberal turn globally and within Costa Rica, rising economic inequality due to things like globalization, due to things like COVID, right? We again see that good governance is eroded. It's no longer worth being a member of the Oil and Gas Alliance, right? It's no longer worth electing politicians with ambitious policies like decarbonization, right? It's kind of turning back, right? And it's raising some really serious social, economic, environmental, and political issues in Costa Rica. Finally, tourism, right? The reason you may have heard of Costa Rica when you came into this room has unfortunately contributed to this rise in domestic inequality, right? If we think about the development of the Costa Rican economy, right, from its early days where we started back, where we started talking a while ago, in the 1820s, coffee had a redistributive effect on society, right? Where coffee produced in one region had the beneficial kind of economic and social effects of blossoming out and helping others, particularly those, though not exclusively limited to those in the Central Valley. Tourism has not had that effect, right? As hotels, mega hotels are owned by private corporations, largely from the global north, and has not kind of made inroads on helping middle and lower income people in Costa Rica to this day, right? So I'd say that Costa Rica tourism has further marginalized the already marginalized. There are a number of transferable lessons or takeaways from this work. I'll leave you with three, right? The first, the most obvious, to just connect to that prior slide, is that policies that would encourage or enforce or mandate local ownership of tourism would be beneficial, right? In addition, tourism efforts that can begin to spread out the beneficial effects of tourism beyond very select coastal regions would begin to have a more redistributive effect on society. Second, and perhaps most importantly, major public investments will be necessary to have a truly green, truly equitable, just transition in Costa Rica, right? It's unlikely that we can get there through some of the measures that have been proposed recently, and those kinds of harkening back to the older policies of Costa Rican politicians would be worth getting into, things like a wealth tax, et cetera. These are incredibly difficult to do in the current day and age. It's worth remembering also, though, that Costa Rica doesn't exist as an island, right? And that the international community, what they do, can have an effect on Costa Rican economy. So forgiving Costa Rica's debt, which has increased tremendously and is a pattern throughout Latin America in the last couple of years, especially due to and exacerbated by COVID, would be a welcome first step. And finally, even though this whole time we've been talking about climate mitigation, the importance of that, it's worth remembering that a small storm, a very small hurricane, can have really devastating effects on Costa Rica. So the main topic this week at the COP meeting that I mentioned earlier is the need to enhance and support climate finance. So more international dollars that could support climate adaptation in vulnerable countries like Costa Rica are necessary and would be very welcome. With that, I will stop. I'd love to take your questions.
This might be me just not understanding the math of the emissions, but I don't entirely understand how they tripled them. But also didn't triple them. I was a little bit confused. I understand once you take out the land, but.
Yep, so, when you include, emissions from land use change and forestry, overall emissions have dropped because Costa Rica has protected forests and enhanced forests, right? So when you look at emissions through that way, total emissions have dropped, right? But when you say, let me exclude any emissions that would come from land use change or protections to forestry, right? Which in a small country like Costa Rica, which has such valued so many forests and such important forest protections, emissions are increasing. So it brings greater attention to the emissions that come from cars. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
I'm curious how you found in interviewing individual people from Costa Rica helped your research, rather than just looking at it from a total outside perspective.
Yeah, so that whole that first research question, right, the kind of historical, macro, structural, economic, Costa Rica's position in the global economy, that mostly is from reading, right, and is important, right, but it doesn't really get at like who's doing what, right, or how did this actually, when there was a meeting about carbon neutrality, who said what, right? And that's what I was interested in. Like, how does this actually happen, right? Because we know that like, okay, we need to go net zero, we need to decarbonize, we need to do all these things, right? Science tells us that, government tells us that, activists tell us that, right? But I was very interested in like, what is actually, when there was a meeting on this, who was there? Who said what? It was impossible to get meeting notes or agenda notes. Those were not shared with me. I don't imagine they were very juicy, but who knows? But I was curious just about what those kind of interpersonal exchanges look like, because there had not been much of anything that I'd seen, at least in sociology, on that, right? Despite, again, these overwhelming calls, we need this, we need this, we need this. Okay, well, how does it happen? So does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, sure.
The concept of the green elite, do you think that's something that could be transferable to a larger country like the US, especially because of like the geographic cohesiveness? Do you think that's the kind of thing that there would be one green elite, a bigger green elite,
Yeah.
several throughout the country,
Yeah.
that kind of?
Yeah. I don't think it's very applicable to the United States. The magnitude of difference and the history is just incomparable, right? I think there could be lessons, right, to an Ecuador, right? To connect to Lucy for a second, right? Which has a more similar kind of economy and a basis for its economy now. Of course, a different post-colonial experience in many ways, but there'd be I'm more interested in comparisons to countries that share a similar colonial experience. Now, the one thing I would say is that people have said to me, well, okay, you can change a lot of these these things. Maybe you can improve good governance, you can change the actors, you can change economics, but you can't change size, right? Like you can't just like change the size of a country, of course, right? But or not, not in any kind of good way, but you could think about think about action at smaller levels of scale, right? So a couple years ago, I want to say I have to say the first Trump administration, I think Goodwin Yearing did a whole Saturday day on like climate action from below, which is a real topic of interest from political science and sort of sociology as well, right? But if you can think about kind of action at smaller levels of scale, I still think that some of what I'm talking about could be relevant there. So, county levels, small groups, institutions, where you might see some of these dynamics at play. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
With the climate action tracker, and we were talking about how, no one's sufficient and Costa Rica is almost efficient. I don't know if you look at this, like, is it also really difficult to reach almost efficient? Like, is that something you look at all?
Yeah, I mean, it is. So this is a list of the other almost efficient nations. Then they look on the face of it very dissimilar. If you look a little bit more closely, you'll notice that a lot of them are very small. So again, that the size factor really does matter. And or they have extensive forests or forestry protection. I think Bhutan has said that it's already carbon neutral or climate neutral. I can't remember. There's a lot of different terms. But it's already something. But I think largely because of its forest protections. So I think it is. The climate action tracker is pretty rigorous and a good source to use if you're interested in use. It's like a credible source if you want to use that for papers or something like that. So yeah, it's not easy. They read the actual policy planning documents that come out of each nation and then assess them. So yeah, thanks. Thanks for your question. Yeah.
When you were talking about the green elites, I was wondering, so when you were interviewing them, since they all like received education and PhD from like USA or Western Europe, I was wondering, did you notice any obvious conflicts between their like likely American centric views or a modern system of knowledge, like versus the indigenous knowledge that could be already existing in Costa Rica?
Yeah, that's a great question. Other people in political science who've done similar research on similar people in Costa Rica have used a different term for the kind of people I talk about. They've called them bilateral activists. This is Paul Steinberg's work from political science. Anyway, he uses that term because bilateral meaning that they're comfortable both in the domestic sphere at home in Costa Rica and at UN climate meetings where they can speak, they're speaking English. These are people who, are very familiar going to Washington, DC, going to Boston, right? They're comfortable in both worlds is how he puts it, right? I use a little bit of a different term because not everyone I spoke with occupies that kind of more privileged position, right? Where some people I spoke with only spoke Spanish, right? So they wouldn't call them equally comfortable in Costa Rica and in kind of English speaking countries or elsewhere in the world. I think that there very much is a focus on using traditional Western science and that kind of frame for climate change. I don't think I spoke to one person who talked about the importance of indigenous knowledge. Now I will, or kind of in getting back to or using indigenous ways of knowing to think about the climate crisis. I will say that Carlos Alvarado prioritized his planning, the planning documents around climate change that were produced during his presidential term are much more focused on climate equity and a just transition and all those kinds of terms than the documents that came out of prior periods. So I don't know if that really gets at your question. That's the closest I can get to answering that. I hope that's helpful. Thanks. Yeah.
To speak about Paul, I remember back in the 90s when I was teaching at St. Lawrence, there was a number of my colleagues who were going to Costa Rica.
Yep.
And a number of programs going to Costa Rica.
Yep.
I'm just wondering if there was a lot of US scholars and scientists down there going where they're working in it.
Very much so. Historically, yes, and I didn't talk about that, but since about the 1920s and the development of the University of Costa Rica in San Jose, Costa Rica has been a hot spot for tourists from around the world, for scientists from around the world, right? Why, right? Because you can go there, collect your data, and not fear a coup or the collapse of democracy, et cetera. So that stability has been huge in terms of enabling more scientists to go there and do research on the species and et cetera that exist in Costa Rica. So actually, we were talking about this in the Good class a couple of weeks ago that, there's probably there's like a inequality in terms of scientific knowledge with more scientific knowledge coming out of Costa Rica than maybe regions elsewhere just because of the political stability. Were there, and then you also asked about were there US scientists involved in the climate change stuff, a few, yes. Yeah, I spoke to 2 scientists from Ivy League University in the US who've been very involved in Costa Rican climate policies, but typically to be part of the political conversations, again, it's small, right? Everybody knows each other. You have to be there for like 50 years. And so you can't, while it's a welcoming space for scientists, right? The political sphere is not necessarily welcoming to farmers, with a couple of notable exceptions on people who have a lot of views about how things should be done, right? But not to say that their influence has been entirely beneficial or without consequence, if that makes sense. Yeah, thanks for the question.
I have kind of a follow-up to that. I was wondering about on one of your slides, it was at the time, and I think the 1990s, you were talking about the money drying up. Costa Rica turned to international projects, and it seemed implicit in the next line that some of that money drying up was money coming from the United States. Were we supplying aid?
Yes, US aid, exactly. Exactly, that's exactly what I was talking about, and that was exactly the source I had in mind. US aid is like sort of development or assistance aid to enable, to kind of try to bring about greater stability and economic well-being and social well-being, right? So the US controls that fund, right, and was basically like, okay, you're done, you're good enough, right? And when that went away, there, it's not like all the problems were solved. It's not like there still weren't development problems and questions, right? So that's why they looked for those other sources of money. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
So besides the conservation of forests and other land use practices, throughout your research, did you identify any other ways that Costa Rica has or is planning on taking to reach a net zero economy?
Yeah. Yeah, the big thing now is electric vehicles. And people are, so an engineer that I spoke with, who was very involved, it's really funny because a lot of people told me over the years, oh, carbon neutrality, what a joke, right? But it's really more about what are the actual discussions and the planning documents look like and involved. So back in the mid-2000s, there were a lot of discussions with the cattle industry and other types of industries that have a significant climate impact, and discussing with them, okay, how can we actually change this industry, et cetera. Those conversations have changed now, and the decarbonization commitment was all about like getting people on electric vehicles. And that's, not necessarily a bad thing, right? But it's pretty difficult. I mean, it's a little bit, it's not as kind of structural. It's not kind of looking at the way industries operate and asking those difficult questions. It's just telling consumers, okay, you don't have to pay the car tax if you buy an electric vehicle. And also because Costa Rica, I don't think I mentioned this, has the 3rd highest car ownership rate in Latin America. It's not necessarily better to just switch the type of car. And then also electric vehicles have all kinds of unresolved kinds of economic and philosophical issues attached to them, right? So that's not the only thing, but it's like 1/4, I think, of the overall decarbonization plan, and one that people can, from outside Costa Rica, can read very easily as, oh, that's great, right? But within Costa Rica, among the members, among the people that I spoke with, they had much more complicated feelings about it, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Wait, thank you. Yeah, Jen.
Just kind of I don't want to say well, first of all, thank you for sharing your expertise about it's like really wonderful seeing what you've been working on. But I mean, just from your social science and your personal perspective, doing all this work and then your feet all almost sufficient. Like, do you think that the labels of these things? I mean, maybe it's intentional to kind of play in a little bit of shaming, to actually pull people to action. But do you, I just didn't know if this is something you thought about, like, the language and what we say and what we being labeled these kind of little as. Do you think
Yeah.
And it's, again, this maybe this is more of a Yale communicating climate question.
Right, right.
But I just love your take on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that it's helpful, like the Costa Rica only achieving, almost sufficient. I think is, I think that people working on the policies in Costa Rica don't care about that. I don't think they're looking at that. I don't think that, I don't think they're obsessing over the climate action tracker, to be perfectly honest. I think that it's, and I think that that's something that, is a little bit more used in the US or Western Europe. And is helpful for, I think honestly, students to realize, wow, there are exactly 0 countries that are in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? I think just the magnitude of that is tremendous. Is it discouraging? I think the people who have been working on these things would say that they're frustrated, it's an uphill battle, right? And that, they wish there was more money to help them, go net zero. But I don't think it's discouraging because they also have people I spoke with have so many decades of Costa Rica really being exceptional that there's now just a need like, hey, okay, we need more money to help us go net zero, right? So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I don't think it dampens spirits. It's more just like, hey, US, you need to cough up some money to actually help us get there because we're in a great position, given our forestry protections, given the kinds of things that we've been doing, given our history of investing in the public good. If you can help us out a little bit more, look how great we could be. And it's just, the Climate Action Tracker is also just one of many websites that maybe not many, but a couple that kind of assesses nations. So I don't think it's the be all end all, but it is again a reliable source and a credible source. I hope that helps. Thanks. Yeah, Leo.
Would you say that the abolition of the army led for the government to form the Ministry of the Environment, or not as a direct result, but it allowed room for it, or yeah?
Yeah, I think that is a little bit part of the myth of Costa Rica, that there will be people who say that, yes, that abolishing the army, somebody said, well, when we abolished the army, we just moved all the money to education. And that is sort of true, but it's also true that the army was very small and very weak and just had been defeated by a militia organized at one man's house, Jose Figueres' house. I didn't even get into all that, right? So I would say that the story about Costa, on the one hand, it is absolutely noteworthy to have a country without a standing army. I mean, that is, I think Costa Rica might be the only country, or maybe in a very small handful. Costa Rica does have a very active police force, which you would see if you were to go there, and that's a whole nother story. But it's a little bit simplistic to say that, well, they had all this money invested in the military, and then they dismantled the military, and then they invested in all these social welfare programs. I mean, theoretically, that is true. It is a little bit true that is the reality. But it's also important to remember the military was extremely weak at the time, and basically by abolishing their army, the Costa Ricans said, okay, US, if anything ever happens, you're gonna come protect us. However, though, right, thinking about some research in sociology, like Michael Mann's work, when you have a country that has a military, you have to keep investing in it, right, and keep it powered, right, and that's something that Costa Rica doesn't do. So I'm not sure that it moved funds immediately from A to B, but rather that by avoiding investing funds in the military over time, it has had a greater capacity to invest in other social welfare programs. It's a really long answer to your question, but I hope it's helpful.
No, it's
Thanks.
Actually, I kind of want to pick up on Leah's question because I just find this aspect of the story so totally fascinating. The analogy between abolishing the military and abolishing carbon, that some people seem committed to driving is just like completely fascinating to me. And I'm wondering if both, I'm just curious to hear you say more about that. Could that analogy be sort of part of the story about the success or the relative success that Costa Rica has had? But then also, does that make sort of the results like less transferable to other cases? This is
Yeah.
a big question.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
like lots of people, including Connecticut College, have net zero goals that we're never really get serious about, but there's
Yep.
something else going on
Yep.
in Costa Rica.
Yep.
Case. I'm just
Yep.
curious.
Yep. Yeah, so this is kind of what I meant early on when I said that, these policies become like, I didn't know how else to say it, except to say that they become embodied in particular people, right? So, Jose Figueres Ferrer, the president who oversaw the abolition of the army, giving the right of women to vote, et cetera, is the one most closely associated with abolishing the army. I think that Oscar Arias, who is the one who drew that comparison between we're abolishing carbon, we're abolishing, I'm sorry, we abolish the army, we're abolishing carbon, is very aware of how he presents on an international stage. And so he looked to President Figueres's history and used that metaphor to kind of ride his coattails, for lack of a better term, into kind of domestic and international significance. So I think that I'm giving you a really detailed answer here, sorry, but I think he's very much an outward focused person. And recognize that he could enhance his own standing and the standing of Costa Rica by drawing on that narrative. Now, since then, I didn't even get to this, Oscar Arias has been accused of sexual assault by many women in Costa Rica, and is really, sort of one of the early examples of the Me Too movement coming to Latin America. He is an extremely complicated figure. And I would just love to talk all about him, but I won't. I'll just say that I think that he recognized the value in drawing on President Figueres's background, and other politicians may have not, because he was always very interested in how he was seen from the early days of his first presidency and going after the Nobel Peace Prize and all that. I hope that helps a little bit. Thanks.
Let Professor Flagg off the hook. Thank you. Thank you. I'll just mention, everyone's invited to hang out. We have a reception set up here. A lot of food. And again, do we have copies of the books? Can we ask if we have copies of Professor Flagg's book for sale? If anybody wants to buy a copy, maybe get an order. So I think we're all going to hang out.
Oscar Arias is a very interesting, problematic person.